Hey guys, this is Starship here, and this is the first ever episode of my new show, Contents of the Fridge. In each episode, I'll be talking about one topic that I find interesting. This first season is dedicated to unsung heroes, and this first episode, I'll be talking about the unsung heroes of the Apollo program, the Command Module pilots. The first Apollo astronaut to hold the designation of Command Module pilot was Don Easley on Apollo 7, I think that's how you pronounce his name. None of the astronauts on Apollo 1 held the designation, which wouldn't have mattered much because, well, it didn't end well even before it launched. As I just mentioned, the first Apollo Command Module pilot was Don Easley. He was the Command Module pilot on Apollo 7. On Apollo 7, they were doing a rendezvous test with a docking target on the Saturn 1B's second stage. On Apollo 8, the Command Module pilot was Jim Lovell, who was also commander on Apollo 13. Now, Apollo 8 was originally supposed to test the lunar module in space, but unfortunately, the lunar module's production fell behind schedule, and when the lunar module was finally delivered, over 100 defects were found. So the folks at NASA decided to launch without the lunar module. Instead, just the Command Module was launched into lunar orbit. While orbiting the moon, Jim Lovell described the lunar surface saying, quote, "The moon is essentially gray, no color. Looks like plaster of Paris, or sort of a grayish beach sand. We can see quite a bit of detail. The Sea of Fertility doesn't stand out as well here as it does back on Earth. There's not much contrast between that and the surrounding craters. The craters are all rounded off. There's quite a few of them. Some of them are newer. Many of them look like, especially the round ones, look like they were hit by meteorites or projectiles of some sort. Langrenus is quite a huge crater. It's got a central cone to it. The walls of the crater are terraced, about 6 or 7 different terraces all the way down. On Apollo 9, the Command Module pilot was David Scott. Apollo 9 was the first crewed space test of the complete Apollo spacecraft. All previous Apollo flights didn't include the lunar module. It was also the first in-space docking and internal crew transfer, and it was also the first mission on which the Command Module pilot had to fly the Command Module solo, as the lunar module undocked and docked with the Command and Service Module. At one point, getting as far away as 179 kilometers from the Command Service Module. David Scott also performed the second EVA of the mission from the Command Module's side hatch. On Apollo 10, the Command Module pilot was John Young. Apollo 10 was a full dress rehearsal of the Apollo 11 moon landings, with Gene Cernan and Tom Stafford taking the lunar module 14.4 kilometers away from the lunar surface. On Apollo 10, of course, John Young's job as Command Module pilot was almost the same as a normal Apollo mission, staying in the Command Module and waiting for the lunar module's ascent stage to return, and then docking with the lunar module. As you might know, the Command Module pilot on Apollo 11 was Michael Collins. Not that Michael Collins, but that Michael Collins. As this was the first moon landing, this set the standard for all the other moon landings. When the Command Service Module was in orbit, Collins said that he never felt lonely, even though he very likely holds the record for being the loneliest human by a distance between him and another human at around 3,565 kilometers between him and Tranquility Base. Someone once said that, not since Adam has any human known such solitude. You might think he might feel a bit left out by the fact that Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin got to land on the moon while he was stuck in selenocentric orbit. But in his autobiography, he wrote, "This venture has been structured for 3 men, and I consider my third to be as necessary as either of the other 2. After Eagle landed, Collins was tasked with finding it on the lunar surface. Mission Control told Collins that they thought Eagle had landed about 6.4 kilometers off target. He looked every time the CSM orbited over to where Mission Control thought that Eagle had landed, but Collins could not find it. While in selenocentric orbit, Collins dumped water from the fuel cells and prepared for Armstrong and Aldrin's return. Just before passing over the dark side of the moon and losing communications with Collins discovered via Mission Control that there was a coolant temperature issue, and that if it became too cold, parts of Columbia might freeze. Mission Control indicated that the solution was to switch the environmental control system from automatic to manual mode, and then implement the Environmental Control System Malfunction Procedure 17. The fix worked and he went back to his tasks. He slept in Columbia to make sure he was rested for the rendezvous, and when Collins woke up, he prepared for some possible emergencies during rendezvous. None of those procedures were put into practice, however, and Eagle successfully rendezvoused and docked with Columbia. On the night before Columbia's re-entry, the crew made it made a TV broadcast in which Collins said, "Saturn V rocket, which has put us in orbit, is an incredibly complicated piece of machinery, every piece of which worked flawlessly. We have always had confidence that the equipment will work properly. All of this is possible only through the blood, sweat, and tears of a number of people. All you see is the three of us, but beneath the surface are thousands and thousands of others. To all of those, I would like to say, thank you very much." After splashdown recovery, he was just in quarantine and attending celebrations after that. On Apollo 12, the command module pilot was Richard Gordon. On Apollo 12, many interesting things happened, such as the vehicle triggered 2 lightning discharges through itself into the ground, which knocked out many of the electrical systems, specifically the guidance systems, which very likely would have meant the mission would have had to have been aborted if it weren't for the quick thinking and memory of ground controller John Aaron and lunar module pilot Alan Bean. And also, the third stage got ejected into solar orbit and then came back to Earth in 2002, where it was mistaken for an asteroid and given the designation of J002E3. But neither of those ones really involved Richard Gordon. From what I was able to find in my research, so while Richard Gordon was on board the command module Yankee Clipper in selenocentric orbit, he did a lunar multispectral photography experiment and photographed proposed future landing sites. Another point of interest as well, to give you all some context, the Air Force and Navy kind of have a rivalry going on. So the backup crew, who are all Air Force, decided to prank the prime crew by putting a bunch of photos of Playboy playmates in their checklists. Richard Gordon got a November 1969 calendar, which featured Dee Dee Lind, who was Miss August 1967. And in 2011, the calendar was put up for auction with an estimated value of $12,000 to $15,000. On Apollo 13, the command module pilot was Jack Swigert. And Apollo 13 was, of course, the ill-fated mission where the astronauts could not land on the moon due to the service module's liquid oxygen tank exploding when the crew attempted to stir it. Jack Swigert was actually the one who turned on the liquid oxygen tank stirring fans, and was also the one who gave the famous "Houston, we've had a problem" line after oxygen tank number 2 exploded. All of its contents, predictably, escaped out into space, but it also caused a slew of other malfunctions, such as oxygen tank number 1 venting its contents into space over the next 2 hours and 10 minutes due to a leak caused by the explosion. After oxygen tank number 2 was empty, the service module was completely devoid of oxygen. 2 of the 3 of the fuel cells in the service module failed about 3 minutes after oxygen tank number 2 exploded, and the last one failed about 2 hours and 7 minutes later, when the service module ran out of oxygen, the oxygen that it needed to function. The high-gain antenna was damaged, and thus all communications was lost with the ground for 1.8 seconds, while the computer corrected by switching from narrow beam to wide beam mode. So now, the crew are in a quite undesirable situation. Around 330,000 kilometers from Earth, on a trajectory around the moon, in a damaged spacecraft. The only power for the command module is coming from the batteries, but they won't last them long enough to get back to Earth. The service module is, as previously alluded to, devoid of oxygen, so the crew decides to save the command module's battery power and water for re-entry by shutting down their command module and powering up the lunar module. Folks on the ground unsurprisingly decided to abort the mission and not land on the moon. The crew successfully completed a circumlunar abort. Unfortunately, the crew had to use the CO2 scrubbers in order to not be dead. The problem was that the lunar module didn't have enough of the lithium hydroxide canisters used in the CO2 scrubbers. The command module had enough, but the lunar module and the command module used different CO2 scrubber systems. The lunar module took round cartridges, and the command modules took square cartridges. They couldn't run the command module system because that would use up its precious battery power, and they couldn't transfer power between the lunar module and the command module. So the folks on the ground devised an ingenious little contraption they called Mailbox, which used a hose that was meant for their spacesuits to make the square filters and the lunar module's CO2 scrubber system compatible. And finally, the crew needed to figure out how to separate the lunar module from the command module successfully without any RCS. So what the boys on the ground figured out was that the crew could pressurize the tunnel between the command and service module to gently push them away. Anyway, the crew returned to Earth, and everyone was happy. On Apollo 14, the command module pilot was Stuart Roosa. While attempting to dock with the lunar module Antares, it took Roosa 6 attempts and 1 hour and 42 minutes to properly dock.
Also, Russo worked as a smoke jumper with the U.S. Forest Service when he was in his 20s. So, before he was about to fly on Apollo 14, Ed Cliff, who at that point was the chief of the U.S. Forest Service, was like, "Hey man, it sure would be cool if you brought several hundred seeds to the moon with you." And Russo was like, "Yeah, that would be cool." So he brought several hundred seeds with him into orbit around the moon, and then planted them on Earth. You can still see them today. They're called moon trees. On Apollo 15, the command module pilot was Al Worden. On Apollo 15, a subsatellite was deployed from the service module's SimBay. There were a few minor malfunctions, such as the light on the service module's propulsion system malfunctioning, the glass cover for the range rates tape meter breaking, and a small leak in the water supply system. There was also some controversy which involved taking several hundred postal covers to the moon and back so that they could be sold and the astronauts' portion of the money set aside for their kids, even though they had never been authorized to do so. I should probably also mention that this was the first Apollo mission on which the Lunar Roving Vehicle, or LRV, was used. On Apollo 16, the command module pilot was Ken Mattingly. Like on Apollo 15, a subsatellite was deployed from the service module's SimBay and was expected to remain in an orbit with a paraloon of 89 kilometers and an apoloon of 122 kilometers. But something else happened instead. The subsatellite's orbit began to rapidly and unexpectedly change. 2.5 weeks after deployment, the satellite had a paraloon of just 9.7 kilometers. But then its paraloon increased to 48 kilometers, and then, only 45 days after its release, the satellite impacted the lunar surface. Nobody knows for sure why its orbit changed, unless you know, in which case tell me in the comments. I will read them, and possibly make a video out of them. I need easy content. Anyway, after about 2 days into the crew's mission, Mattingly reported a gimbal lock warning light, which meant that the spacecraft was not reporting attitude, so he realigned the guidance system using the sun and moon. On day 3, the crew performed the Apollo light flash experiment to investigate the flashes of light that astronauts could see in space when they closed their eyes. We now know that these flashes are caused by cosmic rays. After lunar landing, the lunar module and command module successfully docked. While on return to Earth, Mattingly set up the microbial ecology evaluation device. The spacecraft successfully splashed down and was recovered by USS Ticonderoga. But wait, that's not the end. Because after the spacecraft was delivered to the North Island Naval Air Station, the leftover monomethylhydrazine, which was used as RCS fuel, was being removed from the command module when the equipment that was used to do so exploded. 46 people are injured and sent to the hospital. A hole was blown in the hangar roof 76 meters above, about 40 windows were shattered, and a 10.5 centimeter gash was put in the command module. And one other interesting thing about the mission was that in 2006, after Hurricane Ernesto blew through Bath, North Carolina, an 11-year-old named Kevin Shantz was walking near his parents' beach house, and he discovered a piece of sheet metal with the Apollo 16 mission insignia stamped on it. Turns out, it was part of the S-1C first stage of Apollo 16 Saturn V, which he returned to NASA in 2011 at their request. The now 16-year-old Shantz was given an all-inclusive tour of the KSC and VIP seating for the launch of STS-135. Apollo 17 was the last time humans ever set foot upon the moon. And on Apollo 17, the command module pilot was Ron Evans. Apollo 17 was the only night launch of the Saturn V. The mission went according to plan. A successful launch, landing, redocking, and splashdown. So that's the story of all the Apollo command module pilots. They definitely aren't the most unrecognized players in the Apollo program, but they definitely don't get as much glory as those who actually landed on the moon, so they deserve to be mentioned. Anyway, this is Starship. Until next time, bye. P.S. This video took way too long to make. I'll try and upload these videos at more frequent and regular intervals from now on.